The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. Ludwig Wittgenstein, considered by those able to pronounce his name to be one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, well understood the impact words have on how we view the world. What we cannot speak about, the philosopher said, we must pass over in silence. Language can both limit and expand our perceptions in ways many of us aren't aware. And today I would like to guide you to that same conclusion through the history of linguistics, proof for how language changes the way that we see the world, and finally, what that means for us today, that language influences our perceptions. Language, defined by Merriam-Webster, is a means of communicating ideas. In other words, language is how we process the world, by naming the concepts or ideas that we see. In naming these concepts, we're helping to construct our understanding of them for ourselves. So, obviously, those names are very important. It was this idea of language's importance which first gave rise to linguistics, a study of both the history of languages and how they're related to each other, and a study of how language affects the brain. Linguistics as a science began in 1786, when scholars searched for a common ancestor for many European, Persian, and Indian languages. Since the discovery of that common ancestor, which we now call Proto-Indo-European, linguistics has expanded into many important subfields, including sociolinguistics, the study of the relationship between society and language, which I'll be talking about today. In the wake of World War II, countries affected by national liberation groups had to decide what would be the official language of the government, a difficult question as many of their citizens were multilingual. This question gave rise to another. Why does it matter? What is it about changing the words we use that changes us? People began to search for the answers to these questions, and a cascade of sociolinguistic discoveries began, which has not yet ended. The impact that language has on our worldview is widely recognized within the scientific community. There are many different studies that corroborate this, but one of my favorites is from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. A team of researchers showed native English speakers and native Russian speakers a series of triangles formed by 3 squares of blue. They were then asked to identify which of the bottom 2 squares matched the shade of the top square. Now, Russian has 2 words for blue. Goluboy, what we see as dark blue, and sini, what we call light blue. As English speakers, we don't give separate shades their own names, only quantifiers. And in this study, it was our downfall. The Russian speakers identified the matching shades more quickly and more precisely than the English speakers because of their categorical advantage, because of their language. It's clear from these examples and many more that naming something leads to recognizing it. Now, I don't mean that because we speak English, we can't recognize different shades of blue. We can certainly see the different shades, but having no linguistic category for them deadens our differentiations of those shades. To us, although we may see the color blue, the distinct colors Goluboy and sini simply do not exist. Naming something leads to recognizing it. Our language influences our perceptions. So this is a relevant observation, but why is it important? First, I'd like to take a brief detour through the path of destigmatization to normalization to promotion. We've seen this play out many times in our recent culture. For example, in the American 1950s, there was a stigma against women in the workforce. But today, we see the idea of women succeeding commercially promoted even in our slang with trendy terms like girl boss. The cultural anomaly of women choosing a job outside of the home went from just that, an anomaly, to something which was normal, and now something which is praised. This is a very natural path, and it's been employed by activists countless times. Look at almost any cultural shift, almost any cause which was won, and you'll see it. Even in the ancient world, Christians used this path, destigmatizing themselves through good works, becoming socially perceived as normal, and finally promoted as the official religion of governments. Ancient or recent, near or far, destigmatization leads to normalization, leads to promotion. It's how our brains work. Let's move on, but I will be back to this in a moment. Today, our culture is changing with never-before-seen speed, as evidenced by countless internet trends and fleeting social media sensations. But I would argue that this breakneck anthropological evolution isn't simply due to the media itself, but at a much deeper level, the new words it is introducing to us. In September of 2022 alone, Merriam-Webster added 370 new words to the dictionary, from virtue signaling to greenwashing to sus. Many of these words got their start and widespread usage from the internet. Since the internet's invention, communication has become quicker and easier, and we've added thousands of new terms to our cultural vocabulary, each and every one of them changing the way that we see the world. A great example of this is in regards to self-stimulation, or stimming as it's known colloquially. It's a term usually used in reference to people on the autism spectrum, and some examples might be flapping hands, tapping feet, or making loud, repetitive noises. It's usually harmless behavior, which helps the person to self-regulate when they're feeling overstimulated. However, the first known use of this term was in 1983. For years, when someone saw an autistic child self-regulating, all they saw was someone being disruptive. Many parents and even doctors saw it as just that, an attitude problem, and so would punish the child instead of recognizing their needs. With the adoption of this new term, things have significantly brightened for autistic people, as we are able to put a harmless term to a harmless behavior and develop a much more balanced view of it. This is only one example of how our language and hence perceptions are changing today. However, not all of them are good. Pedophilia is an ugly word. It's a word that is backed by centuries of disgust and rage, and it carries with it the old weight of those emotions. But consider the acronym MAP. What cultural and emotional history does this acronym evoke? None. Yet what it stands for, minor attracted person, is just pedophilia. Pedophilia, by any other, more modern, more forgiving name, is just as evil. Yet its destigmatization through the changing of its terminology will eventually lead to its normalization and promotion. We've already seen the disturbing beginnings of this. In November of 2022, fashion brand Balenciaga released 2 ad campaigns which outraged everyone. The first featured very young child models posing with teddy bears in bondage gear. The second included a photo of a handbag atop Supreme Court case documents about the pandering of child pornography. These ads and their implications are horrifying and are not erased by the quick backtracking Balenciaga has displayed. Now, as a brand, Balenciaga has a record of being edgy, on the borders of social approval. Could their adoption of such vile imagery be a testament to the growing acceptance of pedophilia in extremist progressive groups? The same groups advocating for the use of the term MAP over pedophile? Looking at the UN's recent report, which calls for global decriminalization of all consensual sexual activity, including adults having sex with children under the age of 18. We can surmise in many areas this is no longer an extreme. The destigmatization of our language leads to normalization and promotion of behaviors such as this. In many dystopian books, the power of language is outlined through the government seeking to control it. In The Giver by Lois Lowry, children are beaten if they use terminology deemed incorrect by their leaders. And in George Orwell's 1984, the government was working on a language system which was slowly removing the capability of free thought from its speakers. In both these situations, the control of language was about just that, control. Not only over the words which people used, but the very ways that they saw the world. And unfortunately, this isn't just restricted to sci-fi. In countries like China and Russia, freedom of expression is severely limited. In Tiananmen Square in 1989, the Chinese government massacred student protesters, but today denies the event ever took place. They seek to erase history to the extent of banning their citizens from speaking of it, and they have found success with the younger generations. Even in the relatively free nation of Canada, according to Bill C-16, you can be jailed for failing to use someone's preferred pronouns. The question is, who gets to decide when changing terminology is good or bad? Who decides that destigmatizing pedophilia is dangerous, but that destigmatizing stimming is a noble pursuit? Who can say which changes we ought to accept and which we ought to scorn? These are important, I would even say vital questions that require time and research, open-mindedness, and a strong moral compass to answer. This isn't something we can let popular opinion, government policies, or even our trusted peers decide for us. This is something everyone must reflect upon, unswayed by the opinions of others, to find the objective truth about these issues. Because our language influences our perceptions. Today, we've talked about the history of linguistics, examples of how language changes the way that we see the world, and finally, what that means for us today, what responsibilities we carry with every word we speak. Our language influences our perceptions. And so after what we've discussed, I ask you humbly to evaluate the words you use. Think if the term accurately reflects the concept. Be aware of how your language is actively shaping your worldview, and take it upon yourself to be purposeful and informed in the way that you speak. For the sake of honesty, for the sake of clarity, and for the sake of truth. Thank you.